Welcome to the development series for the F95 X5M. In this series, we're going to be showing you how we design the Eventuri intake from start to finish. So we'll analyze the stock system, go all the way through scanning, printing, developing, prototyping, and testing. In this first video, we're going to analyze the stock airbox, see how it works, remove it, 3D scan, and start the entire design process. First things first, let's open the bonnet, have a look at the stock system, and see how it works. With the bonnet open, we can now see the S63 twin-turbo V8. It's very closely related to the F90 M5 engine, but obviously the packaging is different, so therefore the entire airbox system is different. Let's have a closer look at the airbox system. I need to remove the engine cover. So now, in the F90 M5 engine, the airbox systems were on the side and there was a much more direct path. In this instance, there's a few more things on each side of the engine bay, which means that the airflow is a bit more compromised, so it has to take more of a convoluted path to the turbos. So starting from the air feeds themselves, we've got air feeds on both front sides of the airbox. So there's an air feed right here, and that's feeding from the grill area. So it goes round the side, and there's an opening in the sides of the grills. Now, airflow is being pulled in from these ducts. It joins the base of the airbox, and then the airflow has to then turn 90 degrees upwards through a panel filter. And there's a panel filter just where this plane is, where the screws are. Airflow goes through the panel filter, does another 90-degree turn towards the outlets here, and you've got these rubber connectors to the turbo inlets. So you've got airflow coming from the front all the way to the base, turning basically 180 degrees around on itself into the rubber couplers, and then down into the turbo inlets, and then finally down into the turbos themselves, where the engine is right there. So you've got airflow coming both sides, doing the 180 turn, and then going back around into the turbo inlets. It's a very tightly packed engine bay, so it's going to create some challenges when we're designing the intake. So I can see straight away there's lots of ancillaries, cables, lots of hoses and looms to avoid, but we'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going to remove the brace and then start removing the airbox system, and you get a better idea of the space involved. So I've removed the stock airboxes from the X5M. Let's have a quick look at how they work outside the car. As I explained previously, we've got cold air coming in from the bottom of the airbox, which is this area. And then you can see it's quite a shallow airbox in total. So the airflow is going upwards through this section, through the filter, which is in the middle, and then out to the top, turns again and goes through the rubber section into the turbo inlets. You can see again the top of that airbox. It's got a very aggressive slope on it, and that's for clearance with the bonnet. But yeah, it does look quite shallow. Now, let me take one apart, show the inside, which will make more sense of how much space there is in this airbox. So I've undone the screws in this one. Let's take this apart. Okay, let's start with the base of the airbox. It's obviously been used. So, airflow comes in from the bottom, from the front feed, through this opening into the bottom chamber of this airbox. And there is not a whole lot of volume in there, but it's still pretty decent. There's enough there, and because there's two airboxes, that relieves some of that resistance by being such a small volume, so it's okay. Now, the filter is quite thick, so it sits where that ridge is, hopefully you can see, around there. The filter sits down there, so even though we've got a large opening at the top, the actual filter itself sits quite far down there, so the overall space left is not a lot in there. I'll show you the filter. Fairly standard paper filter, cuboid in shape, so you've got some corners which are quite sharp, and again, as I've mentioned in my other videos, panel filters which have corners like this mean that the full panel filter will not be used uniformly, so you will get areas of turbulence around those corners of the airbox, so the actual flow will be more concentrated around the middle of this filter, so the entire panel filter will not be uniformly used. You're going to get concentrations of flow through the middle part of this filter, and the corners will be, you'll have sort of vortices going on in that area. So that's the filter and the lid of the airbox. Right, so as the airflow then goes through the filter, you've got this small volume again, and then you've got the entry into the cold air feed. So you've got a bit of a sort of lip there, which they've tried to create a velocity stack, and that helps the airflow to smoothen out, captures as much as possible, and then that goes into this rubber section, which then connects to the turbo inlet. That's the airboxes in entirety. I'm just going to show you the cold air feed, which attaches to the base of the airbox. So this is for one side. So this side attaches to the airbox, and this side attaches to the entry, which then pulls in air from the front grille. It's quite a decent shape. It's nice and smooth. There aren't any sharp corners, and there is a flexible section here to allow the engine to move, basically, because the engine actually, the airbox actually moves with the engine. It's mounted onto the engine brace. So this allows that movement, and it's not a concern because this is pre-filter. So there aren't going to be any issues in terms of turbulence going into the engine. So that's actually quite a decent shape. And we could remake these, but I don't really see any distinct advantages of doing that. So we'll probably use these as they are, and we will start our system from this point onwards. So that's the stock airbox briefly explained. It's not a bad system. Obviously, it's been designed within the constraints of the engine bay, so it is a bit shallow. The volume isn't huge, but it's still pretty good. There aren't any obvious issues with the stock airbox system. Our challenge, as always, is to try to increase that airflow with higher volumes, better cold air feeds, that sort of thing, but this is going to be challenging. So we'll get to that when we get to the design phase. One thing I did want to mention is, because this is a European car, you will have noticed that there is no charcoal filter. So we start from the premise of no charcoal filter, so all our tests are done without the charcoal filter. Right, that's that. Let's now move on to 3D scanning the engine bay. I finished the 3D scanning for the X5M. We've now got the scans completely put together with all the layers. Let's now have a look at the scans themselves, and we can talk about the geometry we have within which to work. So I've got all my layers here. Let's start from the top layer. So this highlighted blue is the strut brace. Then we go deeper into the system, so left hand and right hand side. So that's the right side turbo inlet, and you can see the turbo casing around there, the breather for the turbo inlet, and then around the top side is where the intake sits. So the stock airbox sits on that brace where you can see these three mounts. Stock airbox sits there, and then you've got this kind of space above those mounts where the airbox sits. Same thing on the other side. You've got your turbo inlet on the left side, and then the bracing with which the left side airbox is secured to. This is the coolant reservoir, which is on the pre-LCI X5M. It's not on the XM, and it's not on the LCI X5M. it's been relocated. But for our purposes, we have scanned it, and we will need to make that take that into account when we're designing. Finally, we've got the two rear strut braces, and then the rear section of the scuttle panel where you've got the full envelope. I'll also show you now the space vertically. So above this, obviously the bonnet or the hood is closed, and that then gives us our full envelope within which to work. I'll bring the bonnet up. So that's the closed bonnet. Now you can see that triangular kind of geometry within which we have our empty space where the intake can sit. If I just do a section in the middle, you should be able to see that a bit more clearly. Okay, so just cutting that across one side to see how much space there is. I mean, it's not a bad amount of space to work in. There is a lot going on. There is a lot of piping, looms, and obstructions to take into account. So we're just going to try our best and see how we can optimize and make the most use of the volume available. So our intake design will start from where the stock turbo inlets take air in from. And if I just bring up the scan of the stock turbo inlets, right there. So those are the two inlets. You can see, in fact, this one on what we call the right side is circular and larger than this one, which is an oval shape, for reasons I'm not too sure about at the moment. But yeah, they have different sizes. And that's our starting point to go from when designing the system. Right, I'll turn these off now and we can move into the intake design. I'm going to start with the intake ducts first. So the intake ducts pull air in from the stock front feeds, which are located behind the kidney grills. So the ducts feed the filter housings with fresh air. So I'll start with the left side duct first. So this is the finished duct on the left side, and you can see all the features around the back and the sides of this duct where it has to secure to that brace. So this is the brace which the stock airbox secures to, and we've had to use the same bracing. And obviously we've had to cut away a lot of surface to make sure it avoids all these parts and slots into place. And I've tried to make that as large as possible and take advantage of as much area as I can. But the underlying restriction here is this direction of flow. So if the air comes in from this point here, which is where the stock factory feeds end, so it connects to the stock factory feeds, that airflow has to travel through this bottom portion and then up and around this section, so around here, this sort of area, and does a 180-degree turn to come out and exit this opening here. So this is the opening, and the air travels from the bottom, comes up around, does a 180-degree turn, and then will go into our filter housing. So that's an inherent restriction there, which I can't really do too much about at this stage. So all we can do right now is maximize the volume of this duct to try and minimize the effect of that huge shift in flow direction. So anyway, that's the left side duct. Similarly, on the right hand side, we've got our duct on the right hand side. And in fact, on the right hand side, it's even more narrowed down, where you can see, for example, this brace, as it lifts up, I've had to make clearance around the duct to avoid that brace. And again, around the base here, You've got a lot of features removed, a lot of material removed to slot into position. Okay, so those are our two air ducts which feed the filters from the stock cold air feeds which come from the kidney grills. And now we'll look at the filter housings which then connect to the turbo inlets. I've switched the turbo inlets off for now. I'll bring them back on now. Okay, those are turbo inlets. Now, let's start with the left-hand side. I'm going to bring up the left-hand side filter housing. Now, we've managed to use our patented Venturi housing design here just about, and I'll show you what I mean. So, there's the left-hand side. Now, you can see how that connects to the duct. There's a gap there because in that gap there's a rubber seal to allow a bit of movement, just to remove sort of any vibrations, and but that seal basically creates a nice airtight seal for cold air only to go in to the filter. So there's our filter housing, the mouth of it connecting to the duct, and then nicely tapering down to this turbo inlet, and it matches the turbo inlet at this point. Now, if you can see this flat portion on top of this filter housing, I've had to create that because it's so close to the underside of the bonnet. So when the engine is under acceleration, it's going to rock. So when you accelerate, it will rotate laterally. And we need to make sure that as the engine rotates, we have enough clearance between the intake system and the underside of the bonnet. So I've literally used up every millimeter I possibly could. And I'll show you what I mean. If I bring the scan back up of the bonnet when it's closed. Okay, there's the bonnet closed. You can see now the space between that closed bonnet on the inside and the top of that filter housing. It's not a lot, but it's enough for clearance as the engine rocks. So I'm glad that we've had enough space to use our Venturi housing system in this intake. I'll bring up the right hand side housing as well now. Okay. Those are our two housings, and you can see how they connect on each side, giving a nice flow path to the turbo inlets. The housings themselves are as large as I possibly could have made them, so you've got a nice volume within each housing after the filter. So the turbos should be able to take advantage of a less restrictive flow path. Now, I'm going to bring the filters up as well to show you the assembly, and I'll cut through one of those sections to show you what it looks like with a cross section. So you can see there a schematic of the filter, which is inside the filter housing. You can see how there's plenty of room within the housing. There's a nice volume there to allow the flow to move through the filter, up and around the filter housing, and then nicely smoothly taper down into that stock turbo inlet. If I create a section, this will be more apparent. Okay, this is a cross section cutting through the middle of that filter housing. You can see how the airflow, as it exits this duct from this face, so it comes through this face, goes into the filter housing, and then through the inside of that filter housing, smoothly tapers down into the turbo inlet. I'll move this section so you can get more of an idea of the full geometry. So we've got airflow coming in from this part of the duct, moving through the duct, and then having to rotate itself or move 180 degrees around the duct and then into that filter housing, into the filter, through the filter element, and then into the filter housing, and finally then into the turbo inlets, and finally into the turbos. Okay, so that's our completed design for the X5M intake. We've got our two ducts for the cold air feeds, and we've got our two filter housings using our patent Venturi effect design. The next step now is going to be to prototype these components and then physically test them in the car for fitment and for performance. We can then analyze the results and then see what to do from there on in, whether or not we need to optimize and whether or not we need to make any changes to improve on the data that we get. I've got the 3D printed prototypes in front of me. Let's start with the filter housings. So we're using the same sized filter as we used in the F90M5 system, which is tried and tested. Obviously, lots of people are using those in very high powered builds now with very good results. So we know for a fact that it's a very good volume, very good size filter to use. So we're starting off with that process. The filter housings have been made as large as possible, and you can see where I've put a flat surface on the top. Usually it'd be completely spherical, there'd be a nice round shape, but on the top right there, there's a flat surface which is for clearance with the hood or the underside of the bonnet. So that's literally how much space I had to play with. Every single centimeter or millimeter has been used, and I've made sure that we could put these in place and they just about go in place. So that's the side profile of the filter housing. You can see some nice smooth transition from the mouth of the filter down to where it meets the turbo inlets. We're using our patented reverse mounted filter in these. So I've got a housing here which is not assembled. So you can see there's a nice volume inside that housing already. That's post filter. We've got our cone filter there which is custom made for us. Obviously, we designed these with that cone in the back and the cone in the middle. So flow goes through the center of that filter from the large diameter. The cone allows it to separate, comes through the outside of the filter, and as it comes out, this cone brings that flow back to the center, and you get a nice even distribution of flow coming through that filter. Airflow goes into that housing. The housing then shapes the flow nicely down to the turbo inlets. So that's the housing. Now, the challenge was getting the flow to this mouth of the filter sealed. So we're not going for open cones here because it's a very hot engine bay. So a sealed system. So the challenge was how to make the ducts to funnel that flow around to these housings. So I've got the initial prototypes of the V1 ducts. Now, you've got the feeds from the front of the car connecting to this part. And on the initial design, I actually tried to enlarge this portion of the duct to try and maximize the volume. And then the flow would then go through the base of that. The filter sits on top, and it would come around 180 degrees into the mouth of the filter. So if I put this in place, you can just see how it goes together. So you can now see how the airflow would have to negotiate its way around the base of that duct, around 180 degrees and into the mouth of that filter housing. You can see it's very shallow here. It's because there's literally no space to work with. There's lots of cutouts I had to make, and it's more apparent, I think, on this one. Lots of cutouts, lots of intricate shapes to avoid looms, brackets, pipes and hoses. Now, this I mentioned was the first iteration. I actually flow bench tested this version with the housings, and we found that there actually wasn't much improvement over the stock airbox. And that was all down to this duct, because when I flow bench tested just these filter housings themselves, the flow rate was much improved. There was a huge flow rate going to the turbos. But as soon as we put this housing onto the duct, there was a massive restriction. And that restriction is caused by this small chamber and the fact that the flow is having to go 180 degrees, so it's coming all the way around, turning 180 degrees, going back into the filter. So with there being no substantial increase in flow rate on the flow bench, we had to go back to the drawing board. So we had to look at the engine bay again and try and find a way to either improve the volume, which we just couldn't do because we had maximized on all the volume available. So we had to look at another way of introducing another cold air feed somehow into that filter housing, making it more direct and reducing and or eliminating that restriction of the front cold air feeds. So with there being no tangible improvement in airflow with the original duct system, we have to find a way of improving the airflow by de-restricting it. Now, just for context, you can see this is roughly where the housing goes, and you can see around the housing there really is not much more space. So our duct sits here and it then brings air from underneath the housing from the front cold air feed. There really isn't much more space around there. There's a strut brace behind the housing over here, so I can't extend the duct further back to give that airflow more space to negotiate. So kind of stuck. So we have to think outside the box here, and having made 40, 50 plus intakes, I did remember that we used something on the Honda Civic Type R intake where we were able to pull in air from outside from the scroll panel. And looking here, you can see that rubber seal is very tall. So the bonnet, when it closes, sits just touching that rubber seal, leaving quite a substantial gap between the top of the seal and the scroll panel. So if I remove this, you see what I mean. With that rubber seal gone, you can see the bonnet sits roughly where that seal is at the top of that seal, and there's a nice gap there. And behind the gap in this area is ambient air, because you've got openings in the back of this panel where the water comes down and it's allowed to drain down, but that leaves openings for ambient air to then circulate. So if we could utilize this area and have a direct cold air feed coming from the top into that filter, not only would it de-restrict the way the air has to negotiate, it also provides a much more direct feed in terms of direction straight into turbo inlets. Because look at the openings of these inlets. They're literally facing the back of the car. So that feed is very direct straight into that inlet. Using that concept, we then scanned the base of the bonnet, aligned it to the top of that area. Then we were able to design the duct to have a secondary cold air feed. Now let me show you what we came up with. So here's the second iteration of the ducts, which now has a second cold air feed. You can see also we've now changed the front side as well. So this now goes to the stock front cold air feeds, because that was not the restriction previously. It was the fact that it was having to move around that 180 degrees bend, and it was quite restricted down there. So you've got the stock feed, and now you've got the secondary feed right there. That breathes now much more direct, so you've now got airflow coming straight into the filter as well as from the bottom and around. The way that is fed from the top is with these custom-made EPDM air feeds or ducts. These sit in the scuttle panel at the top, and they connect directly to these ducts over there like that. So these move with the engine, and you've got a bit of flexibility in this section, which allows these to move, but keeping a fixed position at the top. And you've got the openings at the front, which is where the air comes into. This makes much more sense in the car. So let's install this prototype in the car, and I'll show you how it works and how it looks. So I have now fitted the prototypes, and I can now show you and explain how this works. Obviously we've got the filter housings in the middle, we've gone as large as possible. The flats on top are to avoid contact with the underside of the hood. We're using the same filters as we do in the F90M5 system, so they're more than adequate for 1000 horsepower plus. Now the ducts. So you can just about see where the ducts are because they're hidden by the housings, but you've got the main feed from the front, stock feed, which connects to the bottom of the duct. That goes around, airflow then negotiates 180 degrees into the filter housings. That's a restriction in itself. So here are the secondary cold air feeds at the top. You can see these custom-made EPDM feeds we've made. We've also cut that center section seal, and that will be provided pre-cut. So we've got the opening in the middle here, which then allows the feed to pull air in from this area. So when that bonnet is closed, it seals up against the top of this, and this entire area on both sides is ambient in temperature. So you've got nice cold air being pulled in from the top of the ducts, through the top section, and directly in to those filters. And you can see where these turbo inlets are facing, that is a much more direct feed going straight in to the turbo inlets, as opposed to it coming from the front, all the way around, and then into the turbo inlets. So we're using both the front feeds and these new secondary cold air feeds. The whole system now is much improved over stock because you've got two feeds. The second feed at the top is much more direct, so it's much less restrictive and allows the turbos to breathe easier. And we'll show you the results of the flow bench test in the next video, but just to illustrate, you can see how much more direct it is visually as well. Now the only problem with this, because we've made these filter housings so big, is that stock engine cover just doesn't fit anymore. Here's the stock engine cover, and it should fit roughly around there, but I just can't get it down because it's touching the ducts and it's touching the housings. So this no longer fits, and to solve that, we were thinking maybe we could modify the stock engine cover, but then we can't expect owners to do the same thing. So in the next video, we will show you the solution we've come up with to clean up this engine bay and make it look as good as it performs. So that brings us to the end of the first video in this development series. In the next video, we're going to move on to carbon fiber prototypes and also look at performance and data numbers. Now, by de-restricting the airflow path, we also de-restrict the way the sound travels. And OEM airboxes are used to attenuate sound, whereas we, by de-restricting the intake, actually increase that sound level. Now, by doing the secondary cold air feeds, we're doing that even more so. So I'm going to leave you now with a quick teaser of what this actually sounds like.